everyone, Barrett Merrill here. This is another episode of Between Sessions where we get to hear from everyday counselors who are helping us engage our stories so we can heal and thrive. Today, I'm excited to be joined with Dr. Carly Downs. She is the clinical director of the Marriage and Family Program over at the University of Alabama. Roll Tide, roll Tide. So really happy to have you today. So Dr. Carly, she has a heavy emphasis on narrative therapy in her practice and how she educates a lot of her students. So really just as a question to jump into this conversation, super high level, how would you define and describe having a narrative or a story? And why is it important for us to understand that each of us has a story?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barrett. It really goes to some of the major assumptions of the narrative theory in general. And one of the major assumptions is that all of our realities in our lives are socially constructed. And I really adhere to that. And what that basically means, to break down, is that, throughout our lives, we are taught from the beginning, from being, as a baby to, all through our childhood, basically what to label the world around us. So we're given labels, we're taught what is right and wrong. A lot of our teaching comes from just observing the people and relationships around us. And so in that, we develop, a lot of times unconsciously, this narrative or this story of things like what are good and what are bad, what's right and what's wrong, what's acceptable and what's not, what's okay to talk about and what isn't.
Yeah.
And through that, that modeling and that observation, and then the covert and overt messages we're given with the people around us, we develop this sense of a story of how we feel about ourselves and how we see the world around us. And in that, it really does happen for everybody. I mean, everybody gets these messages and everybody is taught these things throughout their lives, which really becomes what the narrative theory calls the story, or their person's narrative. And so kind of adhering to that idea that everything is around us is socially constructed, that's really what all those pieces get put together to create our stories and our narratives.
A lot of times I hear people saying things like, you need to leave the past in the past, or the past is no longer active, focus on the present now. I'm curious, just from a narrative perspective, how can this be really problematic when it comes to engaging our story?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've heard those messages too. And even people that come into therapy, a lot of times, they'll say things like, I don't want to rehash the past and things like that. The problem with that is, I think it would be great if we could just ignore all of our previous experiences, especially if they're negative ones, and just move forward. But what tends to happen is our past experiences, particularly the ones that are negative, traumatic, anxiety-ridden, they basically give us what I like to call kind of a filter system, or a filtration system, with how we experience ourselves in the world. So what I mean by that is, if you have a lot of really negative experiences in your life, it's going to put a certain type of kind of blinders or filter on the way we view everything else. So the metaphor that I use that I think is sometimes really helpful for clients and also students that I teach is it kind of sets you up with this certain pair of like glasses that you see the world with, right? And I happen to wear glasses, so it works out. But it's this idea that, the way we view ourselves in the world is really developed through all of the experiences we've had. So the example I can give in that is, if you're somebody who grew up with a message of you're worthless, you're not good enough, nobody's going to like you, you're not going to be successful. It really kind of shapes the way we view the world, so that we're very attuned to those times when we aren't successful, when we are failing. And a lot of times we don't see, or we ignore the messages that don't fit that story, because that's the story we believe or we've been told. So the filter idea, or the pair of glasses, really does filter out or distort those messages that don't fit our belief system. So, for example, if I have a pair of glasses on and in my filter that is, I'm worthless, the times that I'm successful don't make sense to me because that's not what my story tells me. So I'll do one of two things. I'll either completely ignore that message when somebody tells me I was successful at work or did a good job on a project, or I will distort it to make it make sense in my story. So if somebody says, wow, you did a really great job on that presentation, I'll distort it in a way where I'll say, yeah, they probably had to say that. They were just being nice, instead of really accepting the fact that I might have had a success, because that doesn't make sense to me. So our past experiences really create our worldview of how we view us and how we view other people and the experiences around us. So that past, like I said originally, like I wish we could just ignore that past, but that past will really dictate how we take in information throughout our world. And for a lot of people that are struggling, like that can create some issues where we're not seeing the things that are positive in our worldview.
One concept I've heard and am a little bit familiar with from the narrative perspective is this idea of reauthoring or updating memories. And my understanding is that it's not about removing the facts of an experience or a memory so much as it is really reinterpreting the messaging of that memory. I'd love if you could just take a second to maybe elaborate on what that concept means and looks like practically.
Yeah, absolutely. So the process of reauthoring is really kind of the process of taking off those pair of glasses or switching them for new ones, or really expanding that filtration system so that we're seeing a full, thick story of our past and our present and our future. So a big part of the reauthoring is basically talks about how we tend to have very thin stories. So I always have this visual in my head of like a thin book, right? And that's what we look at when we see ourselves in the world. And it's based on a lot of those negative messages we got. And so the reauthoring process isn't about erasing those pages that are there or, burning that original book, but it's about creating a thicker story. So it makes the book bigger and thicker to where we're seeing the things that maybe we didn't see before. So for example, if, I've been through a lot of traumas where people have hurt me in the past, and it makes it really hard for me to trust people, I may not pay attention to the times in my life where I did trust somebody and it worked out, but maybe one or two times, because in my mind, no one's trustworthy. And so I'm ignoring those examples of times that I was resilient and could trust. And so the reauthoring process isn't ignoring the times you were hurt, but it's adding in those pieces of evidence that we tend to distort and ignore so that we can view ourselves in a different way. So, the other piece to this is the major assumption that there's no real true self and that we just have a preferred self. And so the preferred self is the idea that we don't have to live alone by the messages we were given, that we can expand our worldview, that we can look at ourselves in a different way with a different perspective. And that whole reauthoring is really about shifting your perspective, not ignoring or deleting the information we already have, but shifting it to where we can view those past experiences and view ourselves and other people in a way that's more full, to where we can, live in a different way or adhere to different messages than the ones we originally given.
Awesome. Well, this has been another great episode with Between Sessions. Dr. Carly, thank you so much for your time, and we will see each of you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.